empirical fact, the undoubted fact that we all observe, that economic activity doesn't always take place at the same rate. Sometimes there is a lot of economic activity going on, and the amount of economic activity is going up all the time. So not only is a lot of trade, a lot of making of things going on, but also the rate at which people make things is increasing all the time. At other times, you find that there is less being made, there is less value being created, investments are not being made but are being liquidated, and generally you would say that the rate at which economic activity is increasing is actually negative. Now, what that means is that we, as an empirical fact, observe that there are fluctuations in economic activity. What we also observe is that these are, to some degree, regular. In other words, these fluctuations are not just totally random, although the degree of randomness is actually larger than we often suspect. There's some kind of pattern to it, of one kind or another. And so it's an empirical observation that there are cycles of activity in the world of business and economics. In sometimes there are booms, in other times there are busts. That's the sort of basic starting point. That's the thing you need to explain. Why does this happen? And so the economists over the last 150 years have developed many, many theories about why at sometimes economies do better and at other times worse. What it is that causes these business cycles. Now, these theories have important implications for public policy. They have implications, in other words, for what it is that, in the view of the economist, the people in charge of public affairs should or should not be doing. For many economists, the answer is nothing, or as little as possible, or if they do anything, it should be, if you like, structural. For others, it means that the people in charge of current affairs should be doing quite a lot, basically. Now, before I go on, it is worth saying one thing, which is that if you look at anything about business cycle theory, or business cycles as an empirical subject, economic history, what you get is lots and lots of graphs, statistics, and the like. You should be very careful about this because there's a great deal of artificial or false accuracy in much of these figures. In other words, you will get a lot of figures about how much GDP was at this point in time or that point in time, but in fact it's much more difficult to measure things like GDP or the level of economic activity than most people realise. And the margin of error in a lot of these figures is actually quite considerable. It's about 1.5% at least, which means that a lot of the arguments we get are actually really futile. They're within the margin of error. And also, I think myself that it has become more difficult to measure things like the real level of economic activity now than it was, say, 40 or 50 years ago, simply because the development of financial services, in particular, has meant that all kinds of economic transactions now take place in ways that are very, very difficult to track. This is one of the problems facing public policymakers today. One of their major tools, national accounts, things like GDP, national income, unemployment and employment figures and the like, is increasingly not very useful because it's simply more and more difficult to find out what is actually going on. So that's a major caveat to what I'm about to say. Now, the basic division among economists there are two basic splits, if you will, amongst the economists. The first is over whether or not these business fluctuations are natural. For many economists, as we'll see, the fluctuation you get, the cycle of growth and then cutback, is natural. There's nothing really you can do about it. It's just part of the way the economy works. There's something about the nature of the world or human behaviour or economic life which means that you can't expect to have a graph of economic activity that just looks like that. It's always going to look like this. So you're going to have a long-run trend, but there's always going to be fluctuations about that trend. And this is a natural phenomenon, not anything something you can explain, something you can study, but it's not something that you can really, put down to human agency. Nobody intended that this would happen, or nobody did something that directly caused this. It's just part of the way things are. Other economists, on the other hand, think that, in theory, those big fluctuations, anyway, are avoidable, and that to the extent that they do occur, they are caused by action by human beings, and particularly action by people with power. So, in other words, that there's somebody somewhere has made a mistake to cause these either significant upward bumps or significant downward bumps. And also, it's worth saying, even if you take the first view and think that there's something natural about these cycles, that still leaves open the question of whether or not you should do something about it. Rain falling from the sky is natural, the weather is natural, we have days when it's nice and sunny, we have days when it's raining, but that doesn't mean we just walk out and say, oh, it's raining, and walk out without putting up an umbrella or putting on a raincoat. We do something about the fact that there is rain. So it may be that even if you think these cycles are natural, that you believe that people in charge of public policy can and should do something to try and mitigate the effects, to try and smooth out, even out those ups and downs, so that they're not quite so dramatic. So those are the big kind of divisions. Now, there are some kinds of cycles that are widely seen as natural, and these tend to be slightly longer range ones, and these lead to theories about what drives business cycles in general. The man who first developed the theory of the business cycle was this French amateur economist, who's actually a doctor, Clément Juglar, who wrote a book on this in 1862. And Juglar identified what is widely recognised as being a broadly natural business cycle of about 8 to 11 years. And the cycle is roughly investment, prosperity, liquidation. It's often called the inventory cycle, because what ultimately drives it is business inventory, the amount of goods people have produced for which they can't find ready buyers at the cost that will make them profitable to sell. So in this cycle, what goes on is this. People have a broadly optimistic view of the future. They think that in the future, people are still going to be in a position to buy goods. They're going to probably be buying a bit more than they do now. So you are a businessman, you invest money. Or maybe you see that your neighbour down the road has invested in a new machine, built an extra wing on his factory. You think you had better do the same if you're going to keep up with him. So increasingly, a lot of people invest in capital goods. This leads to an increase in output. It also leads to an increase in employment and in the amount of money that people are paid, or the number of people being paid. Not the same thing, of course. This means that more goods are sold. However, after a while, you suddenly find that your market is saturated. People have reached the limits of what they can or are prepared to buy, at least maybe in your area. An important qualification, which I'll come back to. And at that point, you find that your inventory is building up. You find that your warehouse is filling up with widgets, whatever it is you're making in your factory, but you can't sell them. Or at least you can't sell them without really discounting them aggressively. And eventually you reach the point where you can't sell them without selling them at a loss. And at that point, you stop adding stuff to the warehouse. You stop the production run. You just run down your inventory. And this is the liquidation process. You may even then shut down the factory or wrap the machine up, put it in mothballs, and wait until time to recover. And then after a while, the cycle starts again. And as I say, it's empirically observed to be about 8 to 11 years. Now, one of the interesting questions is, does this affect the economy as a whole? Now, one argument is that this kind of thing can happen in individual sectors, and happens in individual sectors all the time. But it shouldn't affect the economy as a whole. That's an important qualification. It should be that there is a glut in one area, but there should not be a general glut. Also, it means there might be a shortage in one area, but there shouldn't be a general shortage. And there was a huge argument in the 1820s about whether or not you could have a general glut. Malthus and other economists like the Swiss Italian economist Simondi argued that you could have a general glut, and others, notably John Stuart Mill and David Ricardo, argued that you could not. And particularly Jean-Baptiste Say. However, Juglar argued that yes, you could indeed have a cycle which affected the economy as a whole, and the reason was simply the infectious effect of optimism. It was what John Maynard Keynes was later to call animal spirits. In other words, it's just that people are misled by the fact that businessmen in other sectors are doing well to expand production in their own sector. And this is it's a function, if you like, of human psychology. But what you also get related to this, and this is not something Juglar talks about, but other observers, is periodic speculative manias. These were first described by an English author called Charles Mackay in a book published in the 1830s called The Madness of Crowds, in which he looked at periodic speculative crazes or manias, such as the one that the Dutch went through in the 1630s for buying tulips. At one point, the cost of tulips in Amsterdam was greater than that of an entire country estate. You could buy a tulip bulb, and it would cost you more than it would cost you to buy 100 acres of land in the Netherlands. And of course, a lot of people eventually lost a lot of money. And the only long-lasting legacy was one of the world's great historical novels, the great novel, of course, La Tulipe Noire by Alexandre Dumas. What you could say is that just as there's a kind of general feeling of optimism that drives the upswing in this 10-year cycle, you also periodically get occasional speculative bubbles in which people believe that typically there's something which can only go up in price. By the way, I should give you a bit of investment advice here. There are three things which, if you see them happening, should make you feel really, really nervous and think seriously about liquidating your assets and turning them into cash. And the first one is when well-paid financial analysts tell you that there is a product out there which can only go up in price. It doesn't matter what the product is. It may be real estate, it may be shares in online companies, it may be gold, it may be anything, it may be apples, tulips. But whatever you see people saying earnestly, there are structural reasons why the price of this product can only go upwards. That is the moment at which typically within about 6 months the price of that product collapses. So that's the first big red light. The second one is when you have eminent economists telling you that we have got rid of the business cycle. So Robert Lucas made this claim in his American Economic Association presidential address in 2006. That didn't work out too well. Irving Fisher, another famous economist, made the same claim in his presidential address in the spring of 1929. And he actually put his money where his mouth was and sold his house, took out huge loans, and used it all to buy stocks on margin. That did not work out well for him, as you can imagine, some 8 months later. So whenever you find that a Nobel Prize-winning economist is quoted as saying that we've got rid of the business cycle, it's onward and upward from here on. That again is time to start selling your stocks and shares and getting out of positions. And the most really alarming sign, the one that should really make you panic and think about laying in the 6 months' worth of tinned food, maybe even, is when lots and lots of people tell you, and you read lots of articles in the business press which say, we have a new economy, particularly if it has a capital N and a capital E. And above all, the really deadly line, this time it's different. In other words, we're in a new world where the old rules do not apply and everything is different now. That really means it is not different, and you're about to find out how it is. So the point is that as well as this kind of regular 11-year cycle of inventory build-up and then inventory running down, investment and then liquidation of investment, you also have on top of that periodic speculative manias, which reflect ultimately, I'm afraid, herd psychology on the part of human beings. Now, economists have also identified other longer cycles as well as the 8 to 11 year one. And in particular, there's the work of Joseph Schumpeter, who I'm sure you've heard of, great economist, according to himself also pretty good in other departments. When he was asked what his ambitions for life were, he said that it was to be Austria's greatest economist, greatest horseman and greatest lover. And when he was asked a few years later how this was going, his answer was that he still needed to work on the horse riding. So a modest chap. In Economica, Schumpeter publishes an article about why business cycles occur. He thinks that the reason for it essentially is technology. And his argument is this. What happens is that all the time, people make major innovations. Now, Schumpeter makes it very clear, he's not talking here about marginal improvements in existing ways of doing things. He's talking about major innovations. Maybe an important technological breakthrough, maybe a new technology, completely new technology, which changes the way a lot of business is carried out. Maybe a fundamental change in business organisation, like, for example, the invention of the low-cost airline. That would be an innovation that would fit into that category. And in particular, the introduction of what are called broad application technologies. These are technologies that have implications for a wide range of activities. The steam engine is one example, historically. The internal combustion engine is another. The internet is another one. They have effects not just on one sector of the economy, but on the economy as a whole, because they transform a wide range of activities. So Schumpeter says what happens is that periodically you get clusters of innovation. And what these do is to transform the economy. Now, initially, what you notice more is the bad side. This is the well-known phenomenon, Schumpeter coined the word for it, of course, of creative destruction. Because when the new technology comes in, lots and lots of old technologies or old ways of doing business suddenly stop making sense. So the internet is invented, and it's quite obvious it no longer makes sense to retail lots of goods through physical buildings that people go to. Most things are increasingly being sold online. How many bookstores have you actually visited in the last year where you've walked into a bookstore? Most people buy all their books online now. And increasingly they don't even buy physical books. They buy stuff for the Kindle, which my wife loves because I have about 8,000 books in the house. And she's told me that if I buy any more books, I have to throw away some of the ones I have. And I don't, of course. I'm what is known as a bookaholic, which means that when your wife tells you to do this, or your spouse, I should say, because there are females of this kind as well, you go and buy books and then hide them somewhere else, and refuse them, or keep them at work, and don't bring them home. But the point is, therefore, bookstores are going out of business. So in the early phase of the technological innovation, lots and lots of old ways of doing things have to be liquidated, which means that lots of people lose their jobs, lots of firms go out of business, lots of capital assets are reallocated in their use. But then you get the second phase when you've got rid of all the old technology and you now have the increased productivity from the new technology. Moreover, in this phase, the people who have been smart enough to adopt the new technology early on, but not too early on, make very big profits because they have a head start. But of course what this means is that then everybody else tries to invest in the new industry, the new product, whatever it is, and after a while competition drives down profit margins. The technology becomes mature and the rate of growth slows. And at that point, Schumpeter says, typically the really ambitious, like entrepreneurial people, look for a new technology. Now this is a much longer cycle than the juggler cycle. This is a cycle which lasts about, interesting question. Schumpeter thought about 30 years, roughly. Many people say that the full cycle actually is more like about 80 to 90 years. And this is often associated with the theory of the business cycle developed by a Russian economist in the 1970s again, Kondratiev. Kondratiev cycles are typically 50 to 60 to 80 years long. And so the argument is that, for example, what we are in at the moment is the early stage of a Schumpeter or Kondratiev cycle. We're in the stage where the new technologies are leading to mass liquidation of the old ones, but we haven't yet got to the stage where they're going to lead to a general rise in productivity and wealth that people notice. They are already doing this, but at the moment people tend to notice more the destruction of the old way of doing things. We're coming out of a period where actually the technologies that drove growth are ones that were developed at the end of the 19th century. Things like the internal combustion engine, heavier than air flight, the telegraph, the electric motor, electrical goods and electrical appliances generally, the iron-hulled ship. These are all technologies that came into existence between roughly 1870 and 1914. Another one will be vulcanized rubber. The telephone is another one. So all these technologies came into existence at the end of the 19th century, and what has been going on ever since is that gradually those technologies have been developed, but they've become more and more mature. Again, there was an earlier great period of innovation in the 1780s to 1820s, the steam engine, power-driven textile machinery, canals, railways, things of that sort. And that boom, that technology finally petered out in the 1860s and 1870s, precisely at the point when the other technology came along. I'll return to all this in the second lecture. So that's another natural business cycle, the one that Schumpeter identifies, which Kondratiev has further developed, which basically sees business cycles as being driven in the last analysis by technological innovation. There are people, and here you start to get into fringe thought, who think there are even longer cycles. In particular, you will sometimes find references to something called an Elliott wave, the American geographer who developed it. This is the idea that history has a pattern of 200 or 300 year long ups and downs, with ups and downs then nested within them. What drives those waves, according to this theory, is two things. One is the weather, the fluctuations in the planet's climate. The other is the sort of biological limitations of the biosphere and the degree to which human beings can do anything at a particular time. So you have, for example, an extremely long down wave from roughly the 3rd century AD through to the 8th century. You've got a big up wave from the roughly the 9th century through to the late 12th, early 13th, and then a down wave from the mid-13th century through to the 15th. So that you have extremely long waves. People are very sceptical about this. I'm sceptical about it myself. I think this is a case of trying to see a pattern that isn't actually there. But you need to be aware of that. There are people who think this. So that is those are, if you like, the sort of natural cycles. Now, think about that. The implication of that is that really there's nothing much you can do about these cycles. Or is it? Many economists say, and Schumpeter was one of these, that really, ultimately, there's not a lot the government can do about this. Public policymakers cannot, and also should not the same thing, really intervene. Because ultimately, this is all beyond the control of human beings. It's all a product of the decisions made by individuals, individual entrepreneurs, individual people, buyers and sellers, and you simply can't control it. It's an enormous, complex social phenomenon that you really can't do something about. On the other hand, there are people who think that you can do something about it. Come to that in a moment. The other thing I'd point out about both of those cycles is that they are physical. They're driven by economic activity in the shape of physical action, actually making and building stuff and buying and selling stuff. These, in other words, are real cycles. They're cycles that reflect changes in people's real physical behaviour. Money and banking is a secondary, consequential factor in those theories. If credit expands in the 11-year cycle that CIKLṟ identifies, or if there is a growth in financial complexity during the 30 to 50-year cycle that you get from Schumpeter, this is a consequence of the technological innovation or business investment. In other words, take the CIKLṟ cycle. The reason why credit tends to expand is in response to the demand for credit by the people who are optimistic and wanting to invest. So the role of banks and of the money system in this way of thinking, these natural models of the business cycle, is as a kind of secondary consequence or effect of real concrete decisions. It's not seen as being the thing that actually drives. As we'll see in a moment, there are a lot of economists, however, who take the opposite view and think that money is what is actually crucial, and that it's money that makes things happen in the last analysis, rather than the actual physical activity of the supply side. Now, other economists, as I say, think, okay, you have these cycles, but we are human beings, damn it. Why should we just take it on the chin and accept it? The classic example of this was John Maynard Keynes, but he's not the only one. In his General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money in 1935, Keynes said, when you have a boom, there are those people who think that the cure for the boom is to raise interest rates. Nonsense, says Keynes. The cure for the boom is to lower interest rates. Because, he said, what you want is not to stop the boom, but to keep the boom going. And so Keynes says the goal for public policy should be in a permanent state of quasi-boom rather than a permanent state of semi-slump. Because what Keynes was arguing essentially was that if you look at that up and down model, then what that means is that, well, he made two arguments, slightly different. One is that over a period of time as a whole, there's a lot of economic waste. Economic resources are not used to their full capacity. What he also argued was that if you weren't very careful, you could arrive at a situation where you had a stable equilibrium, various economic forces are in balance, but this left a lot of resources, particularly labour, but also land and capital, idle. And so Keynes says what you want to do is to run the economy all the time at as close to maximum use of resources as possible. You want to be in a kind of permanent semi-boom. Not a speculative bubble, but a boom. You don't want to have the boom come to an end. So what Keynes and economists after him have been arguing is that this natural cycle is something we should escape from. What public policy makers should do is to do things which will have the effect of keeping the positive phase of the cycle going indefinitely, so that you never have the corrective phase. You never have the running down of inventory. You never have the sudden pronounced liquidation of old assets, or if you do something which compensates for it very, very quickly. The goal is obviously to maintain investment and employment at their maximum levels for as long a period as possible. Now, you can ask about what is wrong with that model. Surely this is something that you want to do. Well, there are arguments against this. I'll come back to there are a whole lot of many arguments against it. But one of the main ones is that, in fact, this is simply impossible. The reason being this: what you have during the any period of economic growth is errors. People make mistakes. They think that a product is going to be profitable, and it is not. They think that a particular investment will make a return that will justify it, and it doesn't. The point is that you have to liquidate those errors, or otherwise you have a serious misallocation of resources. Now, what Keynes thinks is that you can liquidate those errors in a kind of continuous way, so that the economy can still continue at boom level, and you're just continually liquidating the bad mistakes that people have made. However, the argument is that in reality that's not how it works. What happens is that the errors tend to accumulate. It's not a continuous process by which they are liquidated. They tend to build up. And because of that, eventually you find that the longer the boom goes on, the greater this accumulation of wrong investment, of mistakes. And therefore the correction becomes bigger than it would have been had you allowed them to be liquidated in the natural way. In other words, the argument is that you're naturally going to get a cycle in which people make mistakes, and you have to have periods in which those mistakes are liquidated. And the idea is to have these as mild as possible, certainly. But that if you try to simply eliminate those corrective periods when the economy slows down, then you're just going to get a build-up of investment errors, and the problem of correcting those investment errors will become larger than it was before. The other argument against Keynes is that in practice you tend to always try to operate the economy at actually more than it can take. In other words, that the incentives for the politicians, and indeed for everyone in some sense, is to actually run the economy at more than its production possibility frontier. There's a limit in any given time and place to just how much wealth and activity can be created from the resources that the economy has given the structure that it has at that time. And the argument is that if you try to run the economy beyond that production possibility frontier, you are going to have all kinds of very serious problems. You will have shortages, you will have a problem of rising prices, you will have problems increasingly of serious economic dysfunction, goods not arriving, goods not being produced properly because the resources simply aren't there to do this. And then quite unpleasant things happen as a result of that. So that's one kind of very common argument. Now another argument is that cycles are not natural, or at least they're not natural in terms of being as big as the ones we sometimes get. In other words, the argument is, okay, maybe it is the case that you have this kind of graph here. You do have this rough up and down trend. But what you should not be getting is something that looks like this. That's the trend line. You shouldn't be getting that kind of graph. In other words, the fluctuation should be about the long-term average, should be relatively small. What you should not be getting is really, really big ones. And so there's another lot of economists who, contra Keynes, argue that the problem is that some of the cycles you see are natural, but a lot of them are in fact artificial. Really big booms and really big slumps, ones where the deviation from the long-term average is significantly bigger than you would expect. These are not natural. They're caused, according to this way of thinking, by something else. As we'll see in the second lecture, what that something else is divides these economists. Some think it is a mistake on the part of policymakers, some think it's a design fault in an important part of the economic system. But what all these economists agree is that there's something which is making the fluctuations more severe than they otherwise would be. One analogy is that this may be due to, as I've just said, the efforts to delay the natural cycle. So, by analogy, you have a carpet with lots of wrinkles in it. So what you do is you try and push the wrinkles out of the carpet. You end up with a carpet, most of which is nice and smooth, but at one end of it there's a gigantic bump where you push all the wrinkles out. So the argument is essentially that by trying to even out these natural fluctuations in economic activity and stop them happening, in following Keynes's advice of trying to keep the boom going on forever, what you end up with is not a series of relatively mild recessions, but one gigantic crash. Because you've built up, as I said, that accumulation of critical errors. The other kind of argument is that there's something about the way modern economies are designed which means that you're going to have both huge booms which are way over the natural long-run trend, and also massive slumps where the economy contracts by a lot more than the long-run trend. Now, it's worth saying that therefore, there are some economists who think that what you need to do is try and manage these things by policy action. Now, I've already mentioned John Maynard Keynes, and he has a whole kind of toolbox of policy actions that governments should take to try and smooth out this cycle and manage it in one way or another. But that's also Milton Friedman's view. He just has a different set of policy proposals to Keynes. Friedman's view, and the view of the Chicago School, is that the crucial thing is money, and that the main thing that causes these up and down fluctuations is fluctuations in the supply of money to the economy. So in comparison to, say, Schumpeter or Juglar, Friedman does not see money as a consequence, he sees it as the cause of the fluctuation. And the fluctuations, and particularly really big fluctuations, are caused by monetary policy. And therefore what you want to do, he says, is to simply expand the supply of money at a stable amount each year. And if you do that, you will keep the economy, subject to some very minor fluctuations, broadly expanding at about that same amount each year, 3 to 5%. So it's important to realize that in this sense, as in others, as we'll see in the second lecture, Keynes and Friedman are on the same side. They both think that there's a place for public policy in moderating the effects of the natural business cycle. What they disagree about is what the policy should be. Keynes thinks it should be demand support through a number of means, but particularly through fiscal stimulus if you're in a bad position. Friedman thinks that you shouldn't try the fiscal stimulus for various reasons. He thinks that you should rely upon monetary policy to do the job. And so, as we'll see when we come to look at explanations for the current crisis, there's a kind of surprising commonality, if you like, between Friedman and Keynes, or Chicago and Princeton in various ways. Now, on the other hand, there are those who think that it's the problem of trying to do that which leads to really big booms and slumps. And this is most associated with the Austrian school. Now, the Austrian school's argument essentially is that while you do have a natural cycle, which you can't avoid, what governments have increasingly done is to try to correct this, or try to keep booms going, through credit expansion. And what they have done as a result is to make the fluctuations much more violent than they otherwise would be. Now, the way this works is often misunderstood. The theory was first put forward by Ludwig von Mises in his Theory of Money and Credit, which he published in the 1920s, subsequently elaborated by Friedrich Hayek, and then by many other generations of Austrians, such as Jesus Huerta de Soto and others. The best current version of it is a book by a fellow called Roger Garrison, an American economist. Now, what the Austrian theory says is this. Money, again, is crucial. The reason it's crucial, though, is because it's essentially a signalling mechanism. Money prices, nominal prices, send signals to economic actors about what they should do. They tell people where to invest, how much to invest, and where to liquidate investments. If your rate of return, as measured in nominal money, is going up for making and selling a particular product, then you should invest in making more of that product. If, on the other hand, your rate of return in making a particular product is declining, or has even gone negative, you're now making a loss, that's a signal that you should stop making that product or make less of it. However, if the signals that the price system gives and the money system gives are distorted, then people will make mistakes. And not only that, they will make mistakes across the board. So current standard theory goes. And in particular, what is crucial is the rate of interest, which is the price of money, basically. It's the price you pay for money in order to borrow it, that is, in order to invest it. If the rate of interest is too low, people will make all kinds of investments that they would not make if the price of money was higher. Now, in order to understand how this works, you need to understand what a bank actually does, and what banks are doing when they create money, because that's what they do, and lend it out. Banks essentially are time machines. That's a way to think of it. What they do is bring money from the future, or to be more careful about it, hypothetical or possible money from the future, and bring it into the here and now in the shape of credit. Suppose I am an entrepreneur. I go to the bank and I say, I think if I borrow £1 million from you and build a factory making widgets, it will make a 10% discounted annual return over the next 10 years. And so the banks say, okay, we will give you the loan of £1 million that you need to build a factory. And what the bank then does is create a debit. It opens up a debit in an account in my name and a credit in its own account, and that creates the money. What the bank has done is to bring the hypothetical income stream that I expect that factory to create into the future and brought it into the present to give it to me so that I can make the factory, which will then make the income stream, which will service the debt at a cost. Because the cost is interest. What does that cost reflect? The cost reflects a whole range of things, but one of the things it reflects is the bank's expectations of how likely it is that that income stream I expect the factory to generate will actually come into existence. Now, two scenarios. Scenario A, the factory is built, the income stream is generated, I pay the bank back with interest, and I make money myself. Everyone is happy. Scenario B, whoops, I made a mistake. The factory does not make as much money as I thought. In fact, maybe it doesn't make money at all. Nobody wants widgets. And I have to default on the money wasn't there. I have to default on my loan, and the bank has to write it off. It has to cancel it out of existence and take a big hit, which it has to bear. Now, if the bank has got its calculations right, they will offer the interest in a way that reasonably reflects the likely risk that the second thing will happen. Now, suppose I go to the bank and I say, well, I want to make this factory making widgets. The bank says, okay, we'll advance you the credit to do this, but we insist that you pay an interest rate of 12%. At that point, I do the sums. There's no way I can make money out of this. That's ridiculous. This is just too much. So I say, oh, well, thanks, but no thanks. I'll think of something else to do. If, on the other hand, the bank says, well, yes, the Federal Reserve has increased our options. We can offer you this interest rate, at only 1.5%. At that point, I think, what? That is brilliant. I can make a huge amount of money. In fact, don't just give me 1 million, give me 2 million, and I'll build an even bigger factory. And so this is the argument in very simple terms. What happens when the price of interest is the price of money, the rate of interest is too low, is that people make lots of investments which they would not make if the price of money was realistic and accurate. They go and invest in things which ultimately are not going to be worth making money. The problem, of course, is the rate of interest is not fixed. So suppose I borrowed money to build the factory at a rate of 1.5%. The profit margin isn't quite what I expected, but I'm okay because I'm only paying 1.5% interest. But then suddenly I open the paper one day and the central bank has raised interest rates to 5%. And suddenly I do the sums and I realise this investment I made is not going to make money. At that point, what do I do? Now, the argument essentially in the Mises form of this, which is the mainstream Austrian one, is that what happens as a result of artificially cheap credit, too much credit, is that you get an investment boom. It's important to realise it's an investment boom. It's a boom in capital goods. And the orthodox argument of Mises is that what you get is too much resources going into capital goods and not enough going into consumption goods. In other words, people spend too much resources building factories, building offices, buildings of any kind, basically, which are capital goods designed to produce goods in the future, when the consumers really want consumption goods now. And at some point, you find that the consumers basically, aren't interested in the products that the factory is going to be making 5 years down the line. They're interested in something right now, and that factory, it becomes very obvious that factory is not going to be profitable. The problem is that the time scheduling of investment has gotten skewed. Actually, I think that is false. Roger Garrison also doubts that classic Austrian model. The effect is that the credit extraction, what it does is to lead to overproduction of certain goods in certain parts of the economy in ways that's funded by credit. This chart I've got here shows you the actual mechanism that it works by. What you've got here is an economy. This is a kind of hypothetical economy in which, in the initial start, there's 100 cars being driven any 1 year. Now, there are a couple of structural assumptions here. One of them is that the cars wear out. Every year, 10 cars wear out and need to be replaced. So there's a natural depreciation rate of 10%. So in a steady state economy, every year 10 cars are made by 3 manufacturers, and there's still a total of 100 cars on the road at the end of the year. 10 have been scrapped, 10 new ones have been bought and sold. The economy is like just stable. There's also a structural limit, which is each household can only really own on average 3 cars. Some households will have 4, some will be very green and have 1 and a couple of bicycles. But the point is that on average, the maximum consumption of cars is 3 per household, which gives a maximum of 300 cars that the economy can take. Now, in this second year here, the economy is doing quite well. People's real incomes are increasing. So 5 households buy a second car. That means that you now have 15 cars made, and the total is 105 cars. Okay? Again, this is fine. That is natural growth. However, in this year, something happens. There's a bit of a panic somewhere, and the central bank decides to make it possible for the banks to offer really cheap leases, low-cost car loans, which enable people to buy cars that they otherwise couldn't or wouldn't have afforded. So suddenly, in addition to the 10 cars that were being replaced anyway, 20 people get second cars. And this time, you make 30 cars, and the total amount of cars is 125. And the car manufacturers think, oh, this is pretty good. And what they do is, they start to invest in extra capacity and make even more cars, because previously, that was the maximum they could produce, 10 cars per manufacturer. So now they start to invest in more capacity all the time, and they invest each year the same amount, and they increase their capacity, and people can take up more and more loans to buy the cars. And so as you see, year by year, the number of cars being made goes up steadily. At the same time, therefore, the cars are being produced more rapidly than they're being replaced, so allowing for depreciation, the total number of cars in circulation, if you will, goes up here. And then as this goes on, you suddenly get to the point where in this final year you make 90 cars and there are 355 cars in circulation. But remember, the maximum consumption level is 300 cars. So now we have a problem. There are 55 surplus cars on the road. And at this point, what do you do? And the only answer really is you have to liquidate the excess capacity. You have to write off the 55 cars, and you have to write off the excess production capacity that you've got. You've got to go back to somewhere back here. Now, it's important to realise about this. This is not an over-investment problem, because they haven't invested any more in this year or this year or this year than they did in that year. It's not a straightforward overproduction problem, because it's fine up until this last year. The problem is the excessive credit, which is leading more people to consume more cars and therefore producers to invest more in capital goods producing the cars than they otherwise would have done. In other words, the signal that the consumers, and through the consumers the producers has been given, is faulty because of the cheap credit. That's the problem. Now, what that means is that, therefore, in this business cycle theory, the way in which the economy is distorted, the way you go from having a moderate up and down cycle to sudden, quite dramatic fluctuations, is because of action by, above all, central banks. And what the central banks do is to expand the supply of money, but particularly of credit, money in the form of credit rather than physical medium, in order to try and keep the boom going, or even keep the boom at a higher level than it would otherwise be. And what you then get is massive malinvestment. Now, malinvestment is not overinvestment. Overinvestment means too much investment in stuff that is actually productive and people want to use. Malinvestment means investing in products which are not going to make a return because there's no real demand for the products that they're turning out. In other words, it's a misallocation of resources, and that's what we have here. Now, before I go into the next phase of this class, one other thing I have to say is that as well as Austrian business cycle theory, there's one other business cycle theory, which has also grown up in the last 20 years, which is very popular. And this is the main alternative to the Keynesian or Friedman policies that I mentioned earlier. And that is what's known as real business cycle theory, which is associated with a whole number of people, but particularly these two American economists, Finn Kidland and Edward Prescott. Real business cycle theory is a reversion to Schumpeter, in a way. What the real business cycle theorists say is that if you look at this graph and you have an economy which looks like this, the level of economic activity looks like this. Each of these, no matter where you are on that curve, the economy is operating at its maximum efficiency. So, in other words, if you're at a point here, or even this point here, near the top, the economy is operating at maximum efficiency, given the structure that it has. But if the economy is down here, it's also operating at its maximum efficiency, given the structure that it has. So what the real business cycle theorists say is that the cause of the business cycle is exogenous shocks, which can be either positive or negative. And the shocks are of a number of kinds. It may be something like a sudden discovery of a new oil field somewhere in the world, which reduces the price of raw materials. Or conversely, it could be a war in the Middle East, or a structural increase in the price of oil. But most importantly, and this is where they go back to Schumpeter, it's new technologies and new ways of doing business. And what this means is that at any one time, given the structure of the economy at that particular instant, there's a maximum efficiency. But that maximum efficiency will vary, because when you have, say, a new technology coming in, the maximum efficiency will be lower than it would be later on, because at that point you've got the transitional costs of liquidating the old, what Schumpeter talks about, liquidating the old business firms and so on, and adopting the new model. And therefore the economy as a whole is going to be less productive than it will be later on in time at a different point where the new technology is increasing productivity and the old technology is no longer there holding you back. You've no longer got lots of people working in bankrupt bookstores and so on. So the point is that in some ways their argument is that the long run trend is actually just a statistical average. In other words, we shouldn't really think of it as being something real. That straight line that you get here is just a statistical illusion, these guys say. What you actually have is this up and down graph. The economy is always operating at its productive maximum. The point is that what that productive maximum is fluctuates quite dramatically over time, and over quite short time spans. And so we simply arrive at that as a kind of statistical aggregation, but the reality is this regular up and down thing. Now what that means again is that there's nothing you can do about it. Real business cycle theory implies that you can't really iron out that up and down thing. The only thing the government can do is to try and raise the average in the longer term through institutional reform. By, for example, doing things which make it more likely that new technology will be produced, or changing the structure of company formation so that it's easy to form businesses. But their argument essentially is that in the terms of what's happening now or next year, or even 2 years now, there's very, very little the government can do. It's pretty much, the economy is always pretty much doing as well as it can do. So that's the other theory that we have, which is very popular at the moment. Now, what I want to do now is divide you up into groups, and I want you to talk amongst yourselves and come up with questions for me, but also address certain questions I'm going to give you now. The first one is it possible that we can have particular explanations of business cycles but no general ones? In other words, is it possible that we can explain why any one particular boom or bust happened, but we can't explain booms and busts in general? Is it maybe the case that theoretically this is a thing where you can't say, oh, there's a general theory of business cycles, We can only say, this is why this upswing happened, this is why that particular downswing happened, but we can't come up with a general theory. And if so, why? Why might that be? And if not, why not? How can we construct? What do we have to have a general theory? Secondly, something you may have noticed from my talk, it's difficult, it can be quite difficult to reconcile the long-term models of business cycles, like Schumpeter, with the more short-term ones, which emphasize particular decisions that people made. Why is that? Why is it hard to reconcile the long-term models of business cycles with ones that tend to focus on the more short-term? Third one is, I very quickly introduced real business cycle theory, which is the currently intellectually dominant theory of the business cycle, I have to say. What problems can you see with this theory? What are the objections you can see to it? I said it's a sort of going back to Schumpeter, but I'm pretty sure Schumpeter would not have liked it. Why not? You know? And the final one is, if you think about that model of an Austrian business cycle, where a credit expansion that takes place from year 3 onwards leads to misinvestment in productive capacity, in this case in car manufacturing capacity. What that suggests is that when you have an Austrian-style bubble fueled by credit, it doesn't affect the economy as a whole. This is an important point that Roger Garrison makes. It isn't that everybody in the economy reacts in the same way to the cheap credit. It's focused on certain sectors. So, which sectors, if you think about the most recent boom and bust, which sectors has the most recent episode of credit expansion most affected? What are the areas where this phenomenon has happened in the most recent bubble? So, and then, as I say,